VPGs, very exciting topic. So really appreciate you taking the time to come and learn a little bit about what we've done recently and what we're looking at doing going forward. I'll touch a little bit on that, talk about some tips and tricks, and hear from a customer. So just quickly, how many existing Zerto customers are in the room? All right. And prospective customers? Okay. Partners? Okay, great. So I won't belabor what a VPG is, because many of you could probably explain it better than I could. So, but I do have a slide on it because I wanted to at least level set on the VPG, especially if there are some folks that are interested in Zerto and don't quite understand. That's one of our crown jewels. So I'll touch on that. So I'll kick things off. We have 3 speakers. So myself, Chris Duffy, Director of Product Management. I've been practicing this. Hold on. Chris Silipanidakis, Chris T. If anybody can say that, I'll give you $5. So I said it earlier today, and he goes, "You nailed it." And I said, "Well, that won't happen when I'm on stage." And then Mark, our customer from Pechanga Resort Casino. So we'll touch, like I said, what a VPG is. Talk about some latest innovations, future considerations, tips and tricks, and a use case right from our customer. As we talk about VPGs, customers, we talk about it in different contexts, right? If you go talk to someone on the street, they don't know what a VPG is. It's a virtual protection group, often called application consistency group or something along those lines. Really, the premise of that is to group your VMs that make up a VPG. Group your VMs that make up an application into a VPG, right? And that allows to have application consistency and right order fidelity, point-in-time recovery down to the seconds of granularity for near real-time disaster recovery, and being able to rewind at any point in time in the journal. And now if you've heard of the LTR as well, so continuing into that mode as well. And then for orchestration automation. And the reason I wanted to touch on the application consistency as well, and this is some of the things I've been validating this week while I'm here and talking to customers is, when we architected the solution originally, it was application consistency was the #1 priority. And we have delivered capabilities in the product that really are centered around that. And you'll see, and I kind of want to tell a story as we continuously look at that architecture, the original architecture of the solution. We look at our customers, how their use cases have evolved over time, and understanding, do we need to go back and look at that original architecture and make enhancements based on our learnings from our customers, feedbacks from our customers. So, I like to say I'm not, we have my counterparts with their heads in the cloud, the public cloud, or analytics and other things. So a lot of my responsibilities and my team are around some of the core capabilities of the product, be it the VPG, the ZVM, the VRA, and the like. And so it's not always getting the fanfare and the press that supporting Azure, AWS, and things of that get. So, but some of these investments in the core capabilities of the product really resonate well with that, especially with our existing customers, because it really is centered around trying to make your operational lives easier, being able to do more with the tool, and continue to build on that. So some of the latest innovations, if you will, that we've delivered, going back to 6.0. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is really some of the highlights that I wanted. If you know these things or even use these things today, then that's great. One-to-many, delivered in 6.0, allows you to protect a single VM or group of VMs in multiple VPGs, right? So now, and it really expands upon the use cases that we support and that could enable you to leverage in different ways, and I'll talk about some of those use cases. Sub-VPG operations. The story I tell here, again, is the architecture, right? If a VM is sick in a VPG, we put that VPG in an error state, right? And you can't, it might pause replication, you won't be able to do failover. And those are architectural decisions that we made because application consistency was king. But we've looked at our customers have provided feedback, and we've looked at the use cases, and they actually want the to have the choice to continue with, to be able to do these operations on the healthy VMs in the VPG, and they don't want, and sometimes breaking that relationship or breaking out a VM from that VPG is acceptable to them because those are some of the operational things that they need to achieve. And so we've invested and delivered upon some of these things, and sub-VPG is really the first step. I didn't necessarily, when I worked with Dev to prioritize these things, I didn't ask for sub-VPG, so to speak. I asked for always replicate, always recover. And the notion there is, regardless of what's going on, if there are healthy VMs in the VPG, you should always replicate, you should always checkpoint, you should always be able to fail over, right? And so this is the first step to get us there, and there's a continuation to actually get to that end goal. But the sub-VPG is a really powerful solution as well and helps enable additional use cases that I'll touch on. Tolerant failover and evacuate hosts. Again, we just introduced those with 7.0 just last month. Tolerant failover is that next step where during a failover, if a VM fails to come up, we would typically roll back that failover operation. And now we're given the power for you to move that forward and break out that sick VM, if you will. Evacuate hosts, providing more capabilities on the target side, on the protected side, recovery side, if you will, to allow you to evacuate the host and distribute the workloads across the other VRAs in those environments. Who uses, let me pause for a second. Who uses one-to-many today? Okay, pretty good. Who has used a sub-VPG feature? Okay. All right, cool, thanks. And I'm tolerant failover and evacuate hosts. Just came out last month, so I won't ask that. But so a little bit about one-to-many again. Talking about very simply being able to protect a single VM or multiple VMs in multiple VPGs, right? So it's all in one, leveraging the ease of use that we have, and there's really no relationship between the two VPGs. They're really independent objects, if you will. You do this for multiple reasons, right? There's no performance constraints. You're not adding more performance impact on the environment. Still, we pride ourselves in no impact to the production side, no snapshots, no agents, things of that nature. So all that holds true. Configuring different SLAs that meet your business needs. You want to have a local copy or a remote copy or dip your toes in public cloud or send one to our service provider community and supporting various use cases. So again, one of the main use cases for one-to-many is this local data protection. So traditional DR, you want to be protected at a remote location in case something goes bump in the night at your production side. But for normal business operations, you want to be able to, if you just have a server go down or something along those, something very localized, if you will, you want to be able to, you don't have to go all the way to the protected side, and you want to be able to do local recovery. So now you can be able to achieve any compliance necessary or any compliance or any other business compliance needs that you have to protect your data remotely, while being able to service the business operations if you have any localized failure on the production side and you don't have to traverse the remote location. Effective cloud utilization. So this is another key use case that really opened up for many of our customers. Right, you have a cloud strategy, you're considering a cloud strategy, and allows you to go, dip your toe in the water while still maintaining your traditional disaster recovery scenario and solutions. Protection during migration. We work with a lot of customers that go through acquisitions or data center consolidations, and you name it. So really enabling you to do these migration tasks or projects that can take time, weeks, months, what have you, to accomplish some of these migrations and data center consolidations. And you don't have to risk the protection of those environments while you're doing it. You can stay protected, migrate to the new location, and then once you're done, you basically repoint to the new location. You've been protected the whole time. Sub-VPG operations is the next one I wanted to touch on real quick. So this one has been met with a lot of positive feedback. It really opens up. A failover test is one of the biggest use cases, I think, for this, where you don't have to do a failover test for the entire application. You can pull a single VM out or a subset of those VMs out to do a failover to test OS upgrades or a patch or something along those lines, and then be able to roll that back in and clean it up. Tolerant failover I did discuss a little bit, but really, again, providing more capability back into your hands to have you, give the power to you to make those choices if you want to continue on with that failover operation, or as you would typically do prior to this, roll back to the previous state, and then fix whatever needs to be fixed, and then continue on with the failover. Evacuate host. This was driven by one of our, this was a popular one, and one particular customer drove this. It was pretty hard, but all the customers can now benefit from now. So now on the remote side, you have the ability to, at the click of a button, it will intelligently look at the environment, understand what VRAs are out there, what their utilization is, and then make a recommendation so that now you can accept those recommendations. It'll redistribute across those VRAs, and then now you can do maintenance on that VRA. Previous to that, it was a tedious process to be able to go into the particular VM, point it to the new VRA, and so on and so forth. So some future innovations that we're considering. This is not an exhaustive list, but one is streamline the create, and it's called a feature called Copy VPG. So this is really actually close to being delivered, so you should be able to benefit from this in the next release, if not sooner. But in talking to our customers and looking and analyzing the workflow, the create VPG workflow, there's many steps to create a VPG. Each step is really important, but it takes time. And if you're creating multiple VPGs, like some of our large enterprises or service providers often do, it can be an arduous process. So what this is actually leveraging you to do, allowing you to do, is take a pre-existing VPG and use that as a template to create a new VPG, right? And then at the bare minimum, you would just go in and select the VMs that you want to protect, and would have all the settings that you had previously established in that pre-existing VPG. And you'd also have the choice to go through and change anything you wanted, but at the very least, you just select the VMs and you're off and running. Some other things that we're looking at. I'm sorry? So copy VPG is yet to, this is a future. So I said considerations. This is already pretty much built. But we went through a big facelift with 7.0 and redid the whole UI. So this one didn't quite make the release from a UI standpoint because of the facelift efforts. So this one's will definitely be here in Finlagen, if not sooner, because of some of the work left to do. Then a couple kind of forward-looking things and being more intelligent, being more aware of what's in your environment and making recommendations to protect. So one is actually something we have today in the Orchestrator tool, if you're familiar with that, and we support various workflows. It really allows you to automate the selection of VMs, the identification of VMs that aren't protected, that meet certain criteria, and be able to automate putting those into a VPG. And so we want to look at moving that into the UI so that you can select the criteria, whether it's on a vCenter folder or other predefined criteria. If keyword, if a VM has the word prod for production in there, then you've set that criteria so that it would identify that and put that into a VPG that you've predefined.
So would you auto-add a VM to a VPG if it appeared in a vCenter folder?
Potentially, yeah.
That'd be cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about with VApps?
What about with VApps?
So right now, if you add a machine to a VApp that affecting, it doesn't automatically add a VPG.
Yeah. Where's Alon? I saw you walk in. Did you get that? You hear it? So VApp. So Alon Kolschmitz is my counterpart over in Israel. He's one of the product owners, and so I work very closely hand in hand with him for most of the things that you've discussed here. So you want to repeat that so we can?
When you add a VM to the VApp that is being protected, you have to manually add that VM to the VPG. Will there be any sort of feature where you can enable automatic addition of that VM to the VPG?
Yeah.
Once the VM is added. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, let me see if I understood you correctly. You're talking about adding a VM to a VCD VApp and then automatically protect this VApp, right? So if the VApp is already protected, then we'll just automatically add the VM and protect it. I mean, so it should work like this. If not, then the VM gets automatically protected if it's in a protected VCD VApp. If not, then
Yeah, we can take. If
yeah.
that's not how you think it works, well, let's take that one offline.
You have to go into Zerto, and it's a manual job. It's not automatic.
To protect the VApp?
To protect the VM in the VCD VApp.
Correct. If you add a VM to a VApp, it is not automatic.
Oh, so you're protecting the VApp, and then you've already set the protection, and then at a later time you add a VM to that VApp, and it doesn't automatically get protected. I got it now. You got it? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, let's look at that, because that's how it should be working today. So let's take that one offline. No, by all means. What else? So Z commendation. I think that was your name, Alon, right? So we put a Z in front of everything and it makes it cool. So this one is, so we know the relationship between, by looking at the traffic, we understand that there's relationships and interdependencies between VMs. We don't know necessarily at the application layer what those dependencies are, but we just know there's a relationship there. So why wouldn't we be able to see those relationships and make recommendations for protecting those VMs? Maybe one of the VMs is protected, but not the other ones. So helping you identify and make recommendations to protect those VMs. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk about some tips and tricks.
Which Chris? Testing. All right. I don't know if I want to stand on the podium. It seems kind of formal. So, plus I like to walk around. Thank you, Chris. So, first things first. Scylla Punadakis. It's Irish. Yeah, got a joke. All right, cool. So I have the pleasure of being in the field, and I get to work with our existing customers, our prospects, and I've really enjoyed it. We have some existing customers from California here. I'm one of the enterprise sales engineers out of the San Francisco Bay Area. And, there's a couple of things that I wanted to share with the folks in the room, especially for the folks that are existing customers of Zerto. And I think we should do a better job of this, I think, in the field from an evangelism perspective. So what I wanted to do was talk about, when you think about the journal from a Zerto perspective, that really is the gold. That's our secret sauce, right? That's really what drives the foundation of our product from a continuous, remote replication, continuous data protection technology. So the ability for us to allow you to do what you're doing in your production environment with your VMs, whilst at the same time decoupling the virtual machine from the underlying infrastructure where it lives, I think provides a lot of value. And essentially, you can kind of think of Zerto as software-defining replication, right? Because a lot of our customers are moving from a methodology of, I've got hardware, and I'm going to have hardware solve the problem. Hardware solves a portion of the problem, but the ability for you to extract more value out of your virtual environment allows us to be able to help you with that by really extracting away from the underlying hardware and allowing you to make decisions on each virtual machine that may or may not have interdependencies with others. And I'm going to go into some of the cool things that we're doing from an analytics perspective to enable you guys to focus less on the equations required to identify the data store capacity for a journal from an Excel spreadsheet and move that into a portal from an analytics perspective that identifies what needs to be done based on the historical usage of that virtual protection group, right? And we want to move into more of a predictive analytics framework with our customers. But let's start with today, right? So today, from a data store sizing perspective, I'm assuming some of you in the room have gone through the process of sizing a data store for the journal. Is that a fair assessment? Very straightforward, not painful, correct? Wink, wink. It's a progression, right? And so as we kind of discuss, what's the best way to identify journal capacity for a VPG, there's two things. There's the journal capacity at the VPG level, which then is inherited by all the VMs that reside within that virtual protection group. And then there's also the granularity that our technology provides at every step throughout the process. So if you guys are power users of Zerto, you know that when you're creating a virtual protection group, you can apply VPG policies that are inherited by each of the virtual machines. But the granularity in our technology to allow you to express your freedom with the virtual machines, some virtual machine data stores, some virtual machine journal disks should sit on faster storage, and some may not, right? The ability for you as an administrator to determine, is the journal supposed to be in the same location as the replica disks or the mirror disks, is really determination for the administrator, and we allow for that flexibility, right? So today, you have those two options. As an administrator, these screenshots should look familiar. So Zerto's journal, as you guys know, is kind of like that TiVo service that allows you to go back in time and rebuild at that specific point in time a copy of the virtual machines that reside within that virtual protection group. The unique capability of our architecture basically says, well, yes, we do consume journal capacity, we only consume it at the target. And if you go back to what Chris's comments were around the flexibility of testing your production workload without impeding upon that production VM, is some of the great value that we share with our customers. But one thing that we don't talk enough about, I think, in my opinion, is this idea of the scratch volume. How many of you are intimately aware of the process and the purpose of the scratch volume in a VPG? Perfect. You're probably intimately aware with that because you've had extended failover tests and you might have gotten the VM blue screen of death. Okay, I see some nods. So every VM has its own journal, right? So when we protect a virtual machine, we send all of the data associated with the virtual machine over to the other side, and then from that point forward, we're storing delta changes. The delta changes sit in a journal vDisk at the target location in a data store of your choice. And while 99% of what we do from a Zerto perspective is super intuitive, super easy to use, and I give my counterpart a hard time, it's so easy even a sales guy can do it, right? There are some inherent ideas that you need to think about when you're deploying in a pre-deployment perspective. So every journal, right, has every VM has a journal, but when you start thinking about journal sizing, you need to start thinking about if I'm going to consume failover tests a lot. So if I'm going to do a lot of failover tests, and I've got really slow application owners that take forever to log on to the system, it might take them a few hours to actually test the application to their satisfaction. One thing to keep in mind is the scratch disk isn't part of the journal sizing, right? So for example, if you've got a journal capacity of 150 gigs, that journal capacity is only specific to the virtual machine, but doesn't account for the temporary scratch disk that is created when you execute a failover test. So when you execute a failover test, we build the same size journal disk as a scratch disk. That scratch disk is what you write to temporarily for the purpose of a failover test. But the scratch disk is the same exact size as you've defined in the journal. So if you've got a small journal, you can test for a short period of time. If you've got a larger journal, you can test for a longer period of time, right? When a VPG is tested, a scratch volume is created for each VM. The scratch disk capacity is inherited by the journal disk capacity, okay? So from a pre-deployment sizing perspective, if you guys want to kind of do a finger in the air to kind of identify how much data store capacity is required at the target location, really simple equation to help with that, right, is once you fill up the scratch journal, as some of you may have seen in your own failover testing, bad things can happen. So first things first, how do you appropriately size the journal, right? So there's a few options that our customers have to allow for journal sizing. What you want to do, though, rule of thumb from a best practice perspective, is you always want to consider the 2x rule, okay? And this is how eloquent and how advanced my math gets. You guys will see here in a few minutes. It's not very eloquent. You essentially want to account for 2 times the journal, right? So if your journal capacity for each VM is 150 gigabytes, you want to think about, well, if I'm going to do a failover test and Zerto builds a temporary scratch volume, that scratch volume is also going to be 150 gigs, right? You want to account for that when you're deploying or about to deploy Zerto to identify how much data store capacity you need at the target. So again, like we talked about, the defaults come from the VPG, but at any time, you can change those defaults at the VM level, and that's true with everything that we do. So for example, let's take a VPG with 2 VMs in it. So you set a VPG journal of 150 gigs, you add 2 VMs to it. I'm not too good at math, but I know that 150 plus 150 is 300, right? That is accounting for the actual journal capacity. The 2x rule basically says, what you want to do is you want to add another 300 gigs so that you can account for the extended failover testing that you're doing, right? So that's really kind of pre-deployment. That's what we tell our customers when our partners come to us and say, how do we build or how do we identify how much storage capacity is required for this Zerto project? This is kind of what we talk to prospects about and partners about. Excuse me. But that's just for sizing the journal. What if you guys want to do extended failover testing, right? I think one of the coolest things about our technology, even though it's been in our product since day one, is the ability for us to do failover testing with no impact to production. I'll give someone $5 if they can tell me what other replication technology out there, or backup technology even, doesn't impact your production environment somewhat, right? So if you think about the journal-based technology that we have, we reside at the target. So we need to understand what the consumption level is for the data stores over there while your production VMs are none the wiser, right? So what about extended failover testing? Like I said, I think Zerto failover tests are gold. Is there anyone in this room that is an existing customer that has yet to kick off a failover test in their environment? And don't be shy. Perfect. So the benefit of a Zerto failover test is to basically say, before I actually get in that you-know-what moment, I'm going to validate the integrity of the application as much as I want during business hours if I choose to do so, right? Not the case with legacy technologies. You're taking maintenance windows, so on and so forth, right? I can keep going with that. How do you avoid the extended failover test issue? So for the few of you that may not know, the failover test is really designed for a finite period of time, right? That failover test is for you guys to have that get-out-of-jail-free card, or basically be able to build an automated recovery report to give back to management or your internal customers to say, if I'm charging you for this service, you can feel comfortable that we have this automated recovery report that proves the application will be data consistent upon recovery, and your end users will be able to access that application even at your target location. But if you extend a failover test past the capacity of the scratch disk, we lose connectivity to the VMs because there's nowhere for us to write the temporary data to, okay? So how to avoid it. There's a certain number of ways that we've built in with our customers to figure out, hey, what's the most efficient way to avoid the extended test issue? My first response is just don't do an extended failover test. But, you know, that's not the greatest answer in the world. One way to do that, and for some customers that don't have storage constraints at the target, is I've recommended just don't have a journal hard limit, right? So if you don't have a journal hard limit, and let's say you run a failover test for 2 hours, if you've got enough data store capacity at the target location, once you're done with that failover test, you'll get a real-time identification of how much storage is required at the Scratch journal capacity, right? That's one way to do it. Although most often, since it's a shared storage subsystem, you may not have all the capacity in the world to basically figure out how long that 8-hour failover test took, right? And bad things could happen there as well, capacity issues. How many have used the journal sizing tool? I'm sorry. Just kidding, just kidding. The journal sizing tool is and was a great tool to basically identify, here's a number of VMs that I have, here's the right throughput, here's the load, here's how long I want to test, and we'll output some data that then you take and plug into your VPG definition when you create it, right? Another method. Although humans aren't perfect, potential user error, which could contribute to capacity errors, right? And then the good old let VMware do it for you, right? Get into VMware, go into the performance area of VMware and calculate it that way. That was one of the first ways we did it. Since then, we introduced the journal sizing tool, so on and so forth. And, you know, I don't talk about the offsite clone too much in this presentation, but how many of you use the offsite clone feature today with Zerto? Beautiful. The offsite clone feature is exactly what it's intended to represent. It's basically a point-in-time copy at the checkpoint that you've selected. The difference, though, with an offsite clone is it's not tied to a failover test. An offsite clone is essentially a point-in-time representation of the VPG and all the VMs within it. What we do with an offsite clone is if you want to do extended failover testing, here's a use case. You might have some developers, right, or some people that are testing code on a particular VM, updating it, right, patching it, so on and so forth. But they may not get access or have access to that VM for a few hours, a few days. Rather than do a failover test, why not kick off an offsite clone? That offsite clone is fully unmanaged by Zerto. It becomes a managed property of VMware, and you can do whatever you'd like to that moving forward, right? Now, the one caveat I will say, and maybe the people in the room that have executed offsite clones can tell you what's the storage implication with kicking off an offsite clone. Takes twice the storage. That's no different than any other technology in our space that clones volumes. And what you'll hear with our customer here, Mark, is it depends on the use case, right? Some use cases make sense to do offsite clones because you have the capacity, or the capacity isn't as important as the value of basically kicking off an offsite clone and making that available for an extended period of time. Mark will talk a little bit about that. So offsite clone is a great feature. Now, what I want to talk about is some of the things that we're doing moving forward to integrate a lot of these decision-making processes into more of an analytics decision rather than a art form, right? It's more of a science than an art form. And so what if you could identify the Scratch capacity in real time so that if in the future you need to identify another failover test or do another failover test, you have a better idea of how much larger the journal needs to be the next time, okay? Excuse me. So shameless plug for Zerto Analytics. I think there's a recurring theme here at ZertoCon 2019. And that's the fact that we have a very rich and robust Zerto Analytics platform. Rather than expose the folks that aren't using the analytics platform, I'm assuming a lot of you in here are leveraging Zerto Analytics. Is that a resounding yes? For those that can and can call out and call home and do all that. So I've got a couple of screens here, and what I wanted to show with you is In 6.5 Update 2, we announced the capability of basically giving our customers the view into storage. And I really, so I worked in storage for about 13 years before joining Zerto, and the one thing I think Nimble Storage did really well was they introduced this concept of InfoSight. InfoSight was the platform where analytics was derived from. And just like Nimble, where it gave administrators views into other things, that's exactly what analytics is doing for our Zerto customers. So being platform agnostic, decoupling the VM from the underlying infrastructure, since we are software only, right, we ride on top of the infrastructure that you've defined. That's some of the agnostic nature of our capability, right? Not having to go to the same storage frame on both sides. You guys get the flexibility back. But what we didn't have before was a view into the underlying hardware. So what are the compute resources? What's the network resource? What's going on from a storage perspective? The reason I'm honing in on the storage piece specifically is because now we have the capability to provide information from a capacity at a site, a cluster, and an individual data store level. This helps a lot of my customers solve the challenge of, well, I don't know how much storage Zerto is consuming. Now you can go into our analytics portal and view this in real time, okay? We take it one step further, and what we've done is we've also introduced, when you're kicking off a failover test, we're gonna show you the scratch disk consumption in real time, okay? We're gonna let the analytics portal do it for you rather than you clicking on a spreadsheet and inputting manual numbers, right? It's an evolution. So I actually, in my lab environment, kicked off a failover test for one of my VPGs. And what you'll notice is we've got basically the journal, the scratch, the recovery, and the protected. What's really neat about that is now when you kick off a failover test, if you go over to the analytics portal and you search for that VPG, we're gonna have the scratch disk consumption in real time, so you can monitor not only after the failover test how much capacity was consumed, but also to avoid the VM unavailable screen during a failover test. We actually show you in real time what you're consuming, right? This journal, this scratch disk is 16 gigs because its journal is 16 gigs. So if you're approaching capacity during a failover test, this is when you might want to go to the application owner and say, you know what, love what you're doing, you might want to speed it up, right? So that's really what I wanted to share with you guys is the granular nature of what we're basically exposing within our analytics portal. And I would highly recommend, if you have the opportunity, to go and hear the analytics presentation by Lee Kaminsky, because we're doing some really cool things around exposing storage to our end users. But this is the first step. The next step is the ability for the analytics portal to right-size the public cloud, if you're thinking about going there, or right-size another target location by leveraging the existing data that we have about your environment. So if we know what VMs are being protected, we can make some inferences based on the data that we have about what's the optimal number of ZCAs that should reside in Azure, right? How much storage capacity should we have other location if you're looking to build a one-to-many environment? So I hope this was valuable, but I think what really you guys want to hear is from a customer of ours who's actually leveraging our technology and seeing a lot of value from it. So I'd like to introduce Mark from Pechanga Resort and Casino, and it's Temecula, California. You might have to help them understand where that is. Thank you, Mark.
Actually, Chris. I changed my name.
Oh, yes.
Oh, sorry.
We actually said the only way you can present is if your name is Chris as well. Wrong way.
Oh, sorry. So, yeah, my name is Mark from Pechanga Resort and Casino. It's in Temecula, California, which is in between Los Angeles and San Diego. We basically using Zerto in a 3 vCenter environment. We have our recovery site, our production site, and our dev site. we're using the one-to-many with offsite clones so that we can have our application, database, and interface servers over to our dev sandbox environment, and we can go to a granular point in time to have that over there, and we're using that for an extended period of time. So we can do our failover testing and reporting, and then we're also, I was fortunate enough to get into the early adopter program and use some of the features of the LTR so that we can basically look at other backup solutions so that we don't have to rely so much on those other types of applications. So in our one-to-many, we have our tier 1 systems, our slots, point of sale, marketing, and HMS. As you can see, we're going over to the recovery site, but with the one-to-many, we're able to go to our dev sandbox, and they can spin up their own environment at any time. So it's pretty useful that way. Yep, go ahead.
On that previous slide. So you basically have two VPGs.
Right.
One VPG is going to your recovery site. The other VPG is going to your dev sandbox.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about why what's the purpose of the one VPG going to your recovery site specifically? Like it's for making sure that we've got DR of our applications, and then what's the point of a separate VPG going to your sandbox?
So going to the recovery site, that's basically how, if we're going to fail over, that's the way it's going to be. Production's going to come up in a certain sequence. We have PowerShell scripts that start up services in the correct order. In the dev sandbox environment, we basically can do like a sub VPG. We can just spin up particular parts of that VPG when they need it refreshed. So if they need the database or just the application server or just the interface server, we can just restore that on the offsite clone any particular time.
Got it. And you're protecting the same VMs, but different VPGs doing different things from a use case perspective.
Correct.
Got it.
Yes.
Are you using offsite clones primarily for your sandbox?
Yes. That's right. So our failover, we are using it to our recovery site, but offsite cloning is directly to the dev sandbox. And we've had issues in the past where we're doing clones on our production site, and we're just making clones of those VMs so that our dev can use those right. And that has affected production because within the storage, there's some sort of a stall where it freezes the VM. But with this type of architecture, it doesn't touch production at all. So because the VPGs are already on the dev sandbox side of our vCenter.
Did you silo primarily through VLANs and IP, or did you have
It's physically, yeah. Because of we're having issues, and working at a casino, every second we're down is millions of dollars. So.
Yep. So you're leveraging one-to-many. You're leveraging failover test in the intended capacity, which is a couple of hours. But for that extended testing, you've just built another VPG going to another cluster.
Right.
And your developers can pound on those VMs.
They've been using those for months, the same one. So, and they probably refresh twice a year. So, works out.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right, we can open up to questions for any of us.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Wait, more? Which Chris? Okay. Darn. Uh-huh. Same concept, right? Same concept, but different in that with a move and a live failover, you're in that kind of pre-commit, failover before commit. But whatever's written to the Scratch journal in that capacity will actually be commingled with what needs to be added to the VM once you commit that failover. Does that make sense? So the Scratch disk contents only go away when you're specifically doing a failover test. In a move operation or a live failover operation, auto commit of 60 minutes, whatever the case may be, whatever's written to that Scratch space is probably valuable content. We commingle it with the mirror disk and we attach it to the VM. Yeah?
So I do
don't you take, I don't think I need that, but you might.
So when I do failover testing or independent testing, I typically do a move and I just don't commit the move rather than a failover test. So can you explain maybe why one is better than the other, or do you have any opinion about that?
I've got my own opinion, but the guys who developed this, they're also in the back of the room, so they probably have their own opinions too. And then our technical architects, right? So to answer your question, we just want to give you as many ways to be able to test the validity of your applications and your VMs before you fully commit them, right? So the concept of doing a segregated failover test is one way to do that. The concept of basically doing a failover before commit is another way to do that. I like to explain it to my customers and say the following: before you do a move operation, the best thing to do is just test it before you move it, right? So you may be testing that application regularly, but change management occurs, and there might have been something that occurred with the infrastructure between the last time you did a failover test and when you're executing a move. It would be nice to have that final get-out-of-jail-free card to be able to test that virtual machine in a move operation. If you're happy with the way things look, commit it, you're done, right? So it's just another way to give you the peace of mind from an administration perspective that when I do fully commit this move, it's going to work the way I want to. And then, as you know, you have the rollback capability if that's not the case.
Because when you do a test failover, you're not taking down your production.
That's right.
You're bringing up another copy.
Yep.
It can't be on the network at the same time as your production machine.
Sure. Especially if, well, and especially if you've stretched your network between the source and target location, right? If they're two separate, distinct subnets, then the value of our orchestration to be able to re-IP those VMs and do that. But to your point, right? There are more columns in the move and failover live operation before you execute it than there is a failover test, right? One of them being, should I power down the source VM, right? These are decisions that need to be made by the administrator that makes the most sense for whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, right? Many times, a lot of customers forget to select reverse protect, right? Reverse protect is one of those, hey, I'm just going to click a button, and I'm going to fail over in the opposite direction back to the disks where we came from, right? So a lot of intuitiveness in the solution, but there's many ways to skin the cat with Zerto, and you're not necessarily doing anything that you shouldn't. It's just how you want to get to a point where you feel comfortable to click that commit button. Anybody else from Zerto, please feel free to chime in. Yep. Let me toss it over to you. So he's a smart guy.
So one other difference to test a failover with move versus failover test is the checkpoint, right? When you're testing it with move, you can't select the checkpoint. All we do is power off the VM and take a checkpoint and then move it. When you do failover test, you actually get a chance to test the checkpoint, which is very important for consistency, right? So that's another thing to consider when you're testing.
Thanks a lot. Questions? Yes, sir.
So with the real-time storage analytics stuff, do you have to be on Zerto 7 to be able to use that, or does it work for any version?
No, so last time I checked, as long as you're on 6.5 update 2, that will be exposed within the analytics portal. Thank you.
Okay. And then also, is that data saved beyond a test, or do you have to gather that during a test?
It's as of today, if I'm not mistaken, the scratch disk that is shown in the analytics portal is only done in real time, right? So the best thing to do right now would be just to go over to the analytics portal as the failover test is running to get that data. Yes, sir.
Is there anything in the roadmap in the future?
Yes.
VPG management, let's say if you want to move a VM from one VPG to another without having to manually either reseat the disk.
Oh, okay.
So you're talking about moving, merging VPGs or something along those lines?
Let's say you detected some application that has 50 servers because that's what they wanted, and then they decided, I don't want to fail them all over together. I want to have 10 different markets in here that each have 5 servers. But right now, if you want to do that, you have to either take the VMs out of the original VPG and completely re-replicate them, or you have to know where the disks are and manually reseat those.
Mm-hmm.
Coming that will allow you to just split a VM out or split a group of VMs out without having to manually go through
Yeah.
pre-seed and all that.
Another example would be if you're doing a failover DR test
Yeah.
and you're missing a VM,
Right.
and you bring it over for them during that failover test, so now you've got this one VPG that has all but one or all but two VMs in it, and maybe the one you had to bring over for them was a terabyte or 500 gig or something.
Yeah.
Then after DR, you have to go delete the one VPG, either pre-seed the disk or completely replicate the one. It'd be nice to be able to just merge the
Yep.
extra VM into that one. Or
Yeah, and that's the exact term that we've been discussing internally for merge. And when we went down the path of sub-VPG, we talked to customers extensively about, okay, is it acceptable if you do a sub-VPG failover to split it out? Okay, yes, that's okay with you. What if you did not have the ability to merge those back in at some future point in time? They say, well, ideally we would be able to do so, but we would be able to live without it. So merge has been something that we've been discussing. I don't have it definitively committed to a roadmap. I'd love to have the conversation with you because I think you raised a use case that we hadn't necessarily considered. But yeah, so when we introduced the sub-VPG, that was certainly something that we evaluated, but something that I'd love to understand better the needs and prioritize that. What's that, sorry? Yeah, indeed.
We're getting the proverbial hook. So that's just more of a comment than anything else. Any other questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
why is pre-seeding so terrible, and when will it be improved?
Let's take that one
And we're out of
offline.
time.
We're out of time.
We'll leave on a positive note.